The palace in Riyadh was designed to overwhelm. Marble floors that stretched like mirrors. Gold fixtures catching light from crystal chandeliers the size of cars. Ceilings so high they created their own weather systems. Every detail calculated to remind visitors of one thing: Saudi wealth was limitless, and that wealth translated to power. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, known universally as MBS, understood the psychology of luxury. He'd renovated palaces, bought yachts worth $500 million, acquired Leonardo da Vinci paintings for hundreds of millions. Not just for personal enjoyment, but as tools. Symbols of a kingdom so rich that refusing its generosity seemed not just foolish, but impossible. When African leaders visited Riyadh, the formula was predictable. Arrive overwhelmed by opulence. Meet MBS in settings designed to emphasize the wealth gap. Receive generous offers. Infrastructure investment, oil deals, development funds. Leave committed to supporting Saudi positions internationally, staying silent on issues Saudi Arabia preferred not discussed, and opening doors for Saudi economic and political influence. It had worked flawlessly for years. Until Ibrahim Traoré walked into that palace and refused to be impressed by any of it. This is the story of what happens when limitless wealth meets someone who genuinely doesn't want what money can buy. When petrostate power confronts principled poverty. When the richest prince in the world discovers that some people actually mean it when they say their values aren't for sale. The invitation had come through official diplomatic channels. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia cordially invites Captain Ibrahim Traoré for state consultations on matters of mutual interest. The language was formal, but the subtext was clear. MBS wanted something from Burkina Faso. Probably UN votes. Possibly silence on Yemen. Maybe African support for Saudi regional ambitions. Traoré's advisors were divided. Some saw opportunity. Saudi Arabia has resources we desperately need. Infrastructure investment. Development funds. Oil deals. This could transform Burkina Faso's economy. We should listen to what they're offering. Others saw danger. Nothing Saudi Arabia offers comes without strings. They want to buy our foreign policy. Turn us into another African nation that votes however Riyadh dictates. We'll trade poverty for dependence. Traoré listened to both sides. Then made his decision. I'll go. But I'm not going to negotiate our sovereignty for development aid. I'm going to hear what they want, be honest about what we can and cannot do, and see if genuine partnership is possible. And if they're offering subordination disguised as partnership, then we'll decline politely and leave. His team looked skeptical. Easy to say in Ouagadougou. Harder to do when sitting in a palace worth billions facing a crown prince who expected deference. Traoré arrived in Riyadh on a scorching afternoon in May 2024. The reception was designed for impact. Private terminal. Red carpet. Saudi officials in traditional dress treating him with elaborate courtesy. Motorcade through Riyadh's gleaming new districts, towers of glass and steel rising from desert, monuments to oil wealth transforming sand into cities. The message. This is what money can build. This is what partnership with Saudi Arabia makes possible. But Traoré had seen opulence before. Visited European capitals. Met Western leaders in their seats of power. He understood that impressive buildings and expensive cars were props in a performance. The real question was what they wanted in exchange for sharing that wealth. He was taken to a palace guest suite larger than most African government buildings. Marble everything. Gold fixtures. Servants appearing silently to fulfill needs before they were articulated. That evening, a Saudi protocol officer arrived with an agenda for the visit. Tours of development projects. Meetings with Saudi businessmen. Cultural events. And, almost as an afterthought, a brief audience with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Brief audience. The phrasing told Traoré everything. This was theater. Show the poor African leader Saudi splendor. Let him understand the wealth gap. Then have MBS grant him a few minutes, make an offer, and expect gratitude and compliance. Traoré smiled politely and accepted the schedule. But he was already planning what he'd say when the performance reached its climax. The meeting with MBS was scheduled for the third day of the visit. 2 days of being shown what Saudi money could do. Massive infrastructure projects. Gleaming hospitals. Universities with facilities that would make Western institutions envious. All of it funded by oil wealth. All of it designed to make clear, Saudi Arabia could make Burkina Faso's problems disappear if Burkina Faso proved cooperative. On the morning of the meeting, Traoré dressed in his military uniform. Red beret. Simple. Unpretentious. A deliberate contrast to the surrounding opulence. His advisor suggested he might want to wear traditional formal attire. Something that matched the setting's grandeur. "I'm a military officer," Traoré said. "Not a diplomat playing dress-up. MBS will see me as I am, or not at all." He was escorted to MBS's office in the royal palace. More marble. More gold. Artwork worth millions. And at the center, behind a desk that probably cost more than Burkina Faso's annual education budget, sat Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. MBS was younger than many expected, late 30s, Western suit tailored perfectly. Confident manner of someone who'd never been told no about anything that mattered. He stood to greet Traoré with a smile that was warm but calculated. "Captain Traoré, welcome to the kingdom. I hope you found your visit enlightening." "The kingdom is impressive," Traoré replied neutrally. "Please, sit. I wanted to meet personally because Saudi Arabia sees great potential in our relationship with Burkina Faso." MBS gestured broadly. "We're investing heavily in Africa. Infrastructure. Energy. Agriculture. We believe African development is crucial for global stability. And we want to be partners in that development." "That's appreciated," Traoré said. "But I'm curious about the terms of partnership." MBS smiled. "Direct. I like that. Let me be direct too. Saudi Arabia can offer Burkina Faso substantial support. We're prepared to invest $2 billion in infrastructure projects. Roads. Hospitals. Schools. Energy systems. We'll provide favorable oil supply agreements. Development loans at minimal interest. Technical expertise. And we'll do this without the conditions Western donors impose." He leaned back, confident. "No demands about democracy or human rights. No interference in your governance. Just genuine partnership between Muslim nations supporting each other." "And in exchange?" Traoré asked. "Cooperation. When Saudi Arabia needs support in international forums, we'd appreciate Burkina Faso's vote. When we have regional initiatives, we'd value your backing. When certain issues arise that don't directly affect Burkina Faso, we'd ask for your understanding and discretion." Traoré nodded slowly. "By discretion, you mean silence." "I mean recognizing that some matters are complex and that public positions aren't always helpful." Such as Yemen." The word hung in the air. MBS continued carefully. "The situation in Yemen is often misrepresented. Saudi Arabia is supporting the legitimate government against Iranian-backed rebels. It's necessary for regional stability, but some nations, particularly in the West, criticize our methods. We'd appreciate Burkina Faso's understanding that this is a complex security matter, not the humanitarian crisis it's sometimes portrayed as." Traoré was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "Your Highness, can I ask you a direct question?" "Of course. How many children have died in Yemen since Saudi intervention began?" MBS's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "That's a complicated question with disputed numbers. The UN estimates over 150,000 dead from direct violence and indirect causes like famine and disease. UNICEF says thousands of children die monthly from preventable causes because of the war. Are those numbers wrong? War causes casualties. That's tragic but unavoidable when fighting Iranian proxies. Are the children Iranian proxies?" The room temperature seemed to drop. "Captain, you're oversimplifying a complex geopolitical situation. I'm asking about dead children." You're asking me to stay silent about them in exchange for $2 billion. I want to make sure I understand what's being offered. MBS's voice hardened slightly. What's being offered is partnership between Muslim nations. Yemen is a Saudi security concern. Burkina Faso is thousands of miles away. It doesn't affect you. There's no reason for you to take positions on it. Except that children are dying. And you're asking me to pretend that's not happening so you can continue policies that kill more children without African criticism. Saudi Arabia is defending itself and its allies, by bombing schools and hospitals. By blockading ports so food and medicine can't reach civilians. By creating the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. MBS stood. Captain Traoré, I think you misunderstand the nature of this conversation. I'm not here to debate Yemen with you. I'm offering Burkina Faso an opportunity. $2 billion. No strings except basic diplomatic courtesy. That's more than most African nations see in a decade. But there are strings. You want me to stay silent while children starve. I want you to recognize that Saudi Arabia's regional security is not Burkina Faso's concern. Human suffering is everyone's concern. Or are we only Muslims when it's convenient? The religious invocation hit hard. MBS prided himself on modernizing Saudi Arabia while maintaining Islamic credentials. Having an African Muslim leader question his Islamic ethics was not part of the script. Captain, you're being naive. International relations require pragmatism. Yes, there's suffering in Yemen. There's suffering everywhere. You can't save everyone. What you can do is accept help for your own people. Or you can reject it based on idealistic principles and watch Burkina Faso stay poor. So the choice is my people's poverty or Yemeni children's deaths? The choice is whether you accept reality or cling to moral posturing that helps no one. Traoré stood as well. Your Highness, let me tell you about reality. Burkina Faso is poor. Desperately poor. $2 billion would transform our infrastructure. Save lives through better hospitals and schools. I understand that. But here's what I also understand. If I take your money in exchange for silence about Yemen, I teach my people that everything has a price. That our values can be bought. That the lives of poor African children matter but the lives of poor Yemeni children don't, as long as someone pays us to look away. You're being absurd. No, I'm being consistent. We fought colonialism because we believed occupation was wrong. Not because French occupation was wrong, but because all occupation is wrong. We believe children's lives matter. Not just Burkinabe children. All children. And I won't take money to pretend otherwise. MBS walked to the window, looking out over Riyadh. You realize what you're throwing away? $2 billion. Development that could lift millions out of poverty. Partnership with one of the world's wealthiest nations. For what? Symbolic solidarity with Yemen that won't change anything there? For consistency with the principles we claim to hold. You asked for Islamic solidarity. I'm showing it. To the Yemeni Muslims you're killing. The meeting was effectively over. But MBS made one final attempt. Captain, let me be very clear. Saudi Arabia remembers its friends and its critics. If you walk away from this offer, don't expect another. If you publicly criticize our Yemen operations, there will be consequences. We have influence. Economically. Politically. We can make things difficult for nations that oppose us. I'm sure you can. But here's what you can't do. Make me believe that $2 billion is worth more than my integrity. Or that Burkina Faso's poverty justifies Yemeni children's suffering. Traoré picked up his red beret from the chair. Thank you for your time, Your Highness. I appreciate the offer. But we'll find another way to develop Burkina Faso. One that doesn't require us to ignore children dying from preventable causes. He extended his hand. MBS looked at it for a moment. Then shook it briefly. "You're making a mistake, Captain. A very expensive mistake. Perhaps. But it's our mistake to make. Not one purchased by Saudi money." Traoré walked out of the palace. Left the opulence behind. Declined the remaining scheduled tours and meetings. His team arranged immediate departure. As his plane left Riyadh, one of his advisors asked, "Was it worth it? Rejecting $2 billion? Traoré looked out the window at the desert below. "Ask me that question differently. Was it worth keeping our integrity? Yes. Every time. Because the moment we decide our values are for sale, we've lost something no amount of development aid can replace." The fallout began before Traoré's plane landed in Ouagadougou. Saudi Arabia didn't issue official statements about the failed meeting. They didn't need to. Within 48 hours, 3 African nations with close Saudi ties quietly distanced themselves from Burkina Faso. A scheduled African Union Economic Summit suddenly had scheduling conflicts. A proposed West African Security Cooperation Agreement stalled in committee. The message was clear and coordinated. Crossing Saudi Arabia had consequences. But something unexpected happened. The story leaked. Not from Riyadh, they wanted the failure buried. From Burkina Faso. Someone in Traoré's delegation, perhaps Traoré himself, ensured that what happened in that palace reached African media. The details spread quickly. Not the diplomatic language of official statements, but the actual conversation. MBS offering billions. Traoré asking about Yemeni children. The Crown Prince defending Saudi intervention. The African captain refusing money in exchange for silence. Within a week, it was the most discussed story in African political circles. The reactions divided along predictable lines. African leaders dependent on Gulf state funding criticized Traoré privately. Called him reckless. Idealistic. Naive about how international relations actually worked. He threw away $2 billion over Yemen. Yemen. A country none of our people can find on a map. That money could have built infrastructure that saves African lives. Instead, he made a gesture that changes nothing in Yemen and costs Burkina Faso everything. But younger Africans, activists, intellectuals, ordinary citizens saw something different. Finally, an African leader who couldn't be bought. Who stood on principle even against overwhelming financial pressure. Who refused to trade one vulnerable population suffering for another's development. Social media exploded with support. #IntegrityNotMoney trended across the continent. Artists created digital artwork of Traoré walking away from gold coins scattered at his feet. Students organized demonstrations celebrating leaders who chose conscience over cash. The African Union was forced to address it. In a carefully worded statement, they noted that member states were sovereign in their diplomatic relations and bilateral discussions remained confidential. Translation. They wanted this controversy to disappear but couldn't openly condemn Traoré without seeming to endorse selling silence about humanitarian crises. In Riyadh, MBS was furious but constrained. He couldn't publicly confirm the meeting happened because doing so would validate Traoré's version of events. Couldn't deny it completely because too many people knew it occurred. So Saudi Arabia did what wealthy kingdoms do when embarrassed. They tried to bury the story under better narratives. Announcements of increased aid to other African nations. New development initiatives. Strategic partnerships with more cooperative governments. The subtext was obvious: see what happens when you work with us versus against us. But the strategy backfired. Every announcement of Saudi generosity to compliant nations reinforced Traoré's point. Saudi aid came with expectations of political alignment. That this was transactional, not charitable. That silence was indeed being purchased. 3 months after Riyadh, a prominent Saudi-funded think tank published a report titled, "The Dangers of Ideological Foreign Policy in Developing Nations." It didn't name Traoré, but the critique was clear: leaders who let principles override pragmatic national interest harm their own people. When a poor nation rejects billions in development assistance over conflicts that don't affect them, they're not being principled. They're being irresponsible. Leadership requires difficult choices, including accepting help from partners whose every action you may not agree with. The report was shared widely in diplomatic circles. It was supposed to undermine Traoré's position. Instead, it prompted responses. African scholars wrote rebuttals. The report assumes African nations have no moral agency. That we should accept whatever wealthy nations offer regardless of what they're doing elsewhere. This is precisely the mentality that kept Africa subordinated for centuries. The assumption that poor people can't afford principles. 6 months after the meeting, the Yemen crisis worsened. Saudi-led coalition strikes hit a school bus, killing dozens of children. International outcry was intense but brief. Western nations expressed concern but continued arms sales. Most developing nations stayed silent. Burkina Faso didn't. Traoré issued a statement. Brief but pointed. Burkina Faso condemns the killing of children in Yemen. We call for immediate ceasefire and unrestricted humanitarian access. Children's lives are not acceptable casualties in any conflict, regardless of who wages it. Saudi Arabia summoned Burkina Faso's ambassador for formal protest. Called the statement interference in Saudi internal security matters. Warned of consequences. Traoré's response was public: Saudi Arabia offered us $2 billion to stay silent about Yemen. We refused. They seem surprised we meant it. Children died today. We will not pretend we didn't notice because someone wanted to buy our silence. The statement went viral globally. International human rights organizations celebrated it. Western media, often silent about Gulf states' human rights records, suddenly had an African voice saying what they wouldn't. But the political cost was real. Saudi Arabia blocked Burkina Faso from participating in an Islamic Development Bank initiative. Delayed oil shipments. Used influence to complicate Burkina Faso's relationship with other Gulf states. The economic pressure was significant. Traoré's cabinet met to assess the situation. His finance minister was blunt. We're facing real consequences. Saudi Arabia is using its influence to isolate us economically. The $2 billion we rejected would have addressed infrastructure needs we still have. The principle is admirable, but our people need roads and hospitals, not moral victories. So we should have stayed silent? Traoré asked. We should have been more strategic. Taken the money, used vague diplomatic language about Yemen. You can have principles and pragmatism. No. You can't. Not on this. Saudi Arabia didn't want vague language. They wanted silence. And silence about children dying is complicity. His foreign minister tried a middle path. Perhaps we could moderate our public statements. Not silence, but less confrontational language. Maintain our position but reduce tension. Why? Traoré asked. Why should we moderate truth? Saudi Arabia is bombing civilians. Creating famine conditions. We either acknowledge that or we don't. There's no diplomatic language that splits the difference between truth and comfortable lies. The room was quiet. Finally, his chief of staff spoke. Captain, you're right morally. But we need to consider practical realities. Burkina Faso is poor. We need external support. If we make enemies of every wealthy nation whose policies we disagree with, who will partner with us? Nations who want genuine partners, not purchased silence. And if there aren't any, we'll develop slower but we'll develop with our integrity intact. 1 year after Riyadh, Traoré was invited to speak at a conference on African development in Dakar. His speech addressed the Saudi situation directly. Burkina Faso was offered $2 billion. A transformative amount for our country. In exchange, we were asked to stay silent about a humanitarian crisis. To ignore children dying. To pretend Yemen's suffering didn't concern us because it wasn't our region, our problem, our business. We said no. And many people said we were foolish. That poor countries can't afford principles. That we should take what's offered and be grateful. But I want to challenge that assumption. The idea that poverty means we must surrender our moral agency. That being poor means we can't speak truth about injustice. That our need for development justifies silence about others' suffering. This is the mentality that kept Africa subordinated for centuries. The idea that we should accept whatever scraps wealthy nations offer and ask no questions about where that wealth comes from or what's expected in return. Yes, Burkina Faso is poor. Yes, $2 billion would have helped our people. But what kind of people would we become if we accepted money to ignore dying children? What would we teach our next generation about the price of their values? That everything can be bought if the offer is high enough? Some say this is naive. That international relations require pragmatism, not idealism. But I've learned something. The people who tell you principles are naive are usually the people who profit from you abandoning those principles. Saudi Arabia isn't upset because we're naive. They're upset because we're not for sale. And that disrupts the system they've built where money purchases silence. The speech was met with standing ovation from about half the room. The other half sat in uncomfortable silence. Because many African governments had taken Saudi money and given the requested silence. Traoré's principled stand implicitly criticized their pragmatic choices. Saudi Arabia issued a formal response. Not to the speech directly, but through proxies. Captain Traoré speaks passionately about principles while his people lack basic infrastructure. Perhaps if he focused more on developing Burkina Faso and less on criticizing nations trying to help Africa, his country would be better served. But the response rang hollow. Because it confirmed exactly what Traoré had said, Saudi Arabia wanted gratitude and silence, not partnership with equals. The controversy put other African leaders in an awkward position. Privately, some agreed with Traoré. Saudi intervention in Yemen was creating unconscionable suffering. But they'd taken Saudi money and couldn't say so publicly without looking either hypocritical or beholden. A few found middle ground. Began quietly expressing concern about Yemen in international forums. Not as forcefully as Traoré, but more than the complete silence Saudi Arabia preferred. The wall of African acquiescence to Gulf state policies was cracking. And Saudi Arabia noticed. 18 months after the failed meeting, something unexpected happened. A Saudi diplomat requested quiet back-channel communication with Burkina Faso. Not about reconciliation. About understanding. The message was curious. Crown Prince MBS wanted to know why Traoré had really refused. Not the public statements. The actual reason. Was it genuine principle? Political posturing? Anti-Saudi bias? The diplomat was clear, this wasn't negotiation. Just inquiry. Traoré agreed to respond, also through back channels. His message was simple: I refused because accepting would have taught my people that our values are for sale. That we condemn injustice only when it's convenient or cost-free. That poor people can't afford moral consistency. I rejected the money because the price wasn't $2 billion. The price was our integrity. And that's not for sale at any amount. Tell the Crown Prince, I don't hate Saudi Arabia. I oppose Saudi policy in Yemen. Just as I'd oppose any nation, including my own, creating humanitarian catastrophe. This isn't personal. It's principled. MBS's response came a week later, also back channel: I understand principle. I govern by it. My principle is Saudi security and regional stability. Sometimes that requires difficult actions with unfortunate consequences. I offered you partnership. You chose grandstanding. Your principles won't build roads. Your integrity won't feed hungry children. You'll realize this eventually. But by then, the opportunity will be gone. Traoré's final message: Your Highness, you're right that principles don't build roads. But they build character. They build nations that last beyond oil revenues and royal dynasties. They build societies where leaders serve people, not the other way around. Burkina Faso may stay poor longer because we refused your money. But we'll be poor with our heads up, not rich on our knees. That's a trade I'll make every time. 2 years after Riyadh, the dynamic had shifted in unexpected ways. Saudi Arabia continued investing heavily in Africa, but started including more transparency and accountability measures. Not because they'd become altruistic, but because Traoré's stand had created demand for it. African civil society organizations began scrutinizing Gulf state investments more carefully, asking harder questions about terms and expectations, demanding clarity about what partnership actually meant. The era of unquestioned acceptance of Gulf money was ending. And while Saudi Arabia still had willing partners who'd take funding without asking difficult questions, they were finding younger African leaders less automatically deferential. The generation that had watched Traoré refuse billions was entering politics with different expectations. Burkina Faso remained poor. Poorer than it would have been with Saudi investment. That was undeniable. But something else was also undeniable. Traoré had proven that African leaders could say no to wealthy powers. Could demand genuine partnership rather than accepting subordination disguised as aid. Could speak moral truth even when economically costly. Whether that was worth $2 billion remained debatable. But it was worth something. Something harder to quantify than infrastructure but perhaps more valuable in the long term. The idea that some things actually weren't for sale. Years later, when asked about the Saudi meeting, Traoré always gave the same answer: people ask if I regret refusing $2 billion. I don't. I regret that we live in a world where wealthy nations believe everything has a price. Where they're genuinely shocked when someone says no to money because the money comes with unacceptable conditions. MBS offered billions. I asked one question: what's the price in Yemeni children's lives? He didn't have an answer that justified the money. So I walked away. Not because I don't care about Burkina Faso's development. But because I understand that development built on ignoring others' suffering is built on sand. It might look impressive. But it won't last. And it won't be worth what we paid for it. The meeting ended because MBS realized I actually meant it when I said our values weren't for sale. He's used to people who say that but don't mean it. Who have a price, even if it's high. I don't. Burkina Faso doesn't. And that's worth more than any amount Saudi Arabia could offer.